Hello, everyone. Welcome to PPAN's May 2026 webinar, Mosquito Control, Science, Risks, and Solutions. And we've got some really awesome Xerces pesticide program specialists with us here today. Thank you all for being here and joining us. My name is Anna Gray Anderson, and I'm the Community Engagement Manager for People and Pollinators Action Network, or PPAN for short. For those of you who aren't familiar with our webinar series, we usually host a monthly event, so be sure to sign up for our e-news and check out our events calendar to keep up to date with all of the events we have going on. And we can put this link in the chat for you. And before we get started, I just wanted to tell you a little bit more about us. So, like I said, we are People and Pollinators Action Network, or PPAN, the host of this webinar. We focus a lot on making Colorado a safe haven for all who live here, from people to pollinators. And we do this through grassroots advocacy, education, and outreach, kind of like this webinar. We also do a lot of policy work, community mobilization, and habitat creation. A good example of this is our recent state policy win of House Bill 261132 that prioritizes the use of native plants on state-owned lands. Another example is our Habitat Fund grants program, which is based on the sales of the pollinator license plate that goes towards creating pollinator-safe habitat while promoting community mobilization. And I did just want to emphasize the significance of the Protect Pollinators license plate. So PPAN championed the legislation that created this plate, and the majority of the donations for the plate go directly to the Protect Our Pollinators Habitat Fund. And since 2023, we've been able to support 96 projects, which have resulted in the creation of about 65 acres of pollinator-safe habitat. So by getting a plate, you'll be contributing directly to getting more native plants in the ground, which leads to more pollinators. And we'll put this link in the chat as well. So we're really excited to have the urban policy lead and Xerces pesticide program specialist, Jacqueline Winrostra, with us today. Jacqueline works with Xerces partners and community members and leaders to reduce pesticide use in towns, cities, and campuses through strategic outreach and policy action. Prior to joining Xerces, Jacqueline worked with local governments in Colorado and Florida to enhance their integrated pest and pollinator management, promote biological control, and reduce reliance on pesticides. Her greatest passion is working directly with community members and decision makers to protect the invertebrate life that sustains us. Jacqueline holds a Master of Science in Entomology from Colorado State University, and when she's not advocating for invertebrates, you can find her hiking through the forest or recreating nature's beauty in stained glass. We're also honored to have the Towns and Cities Lead and Xerces Pesticide Program Specialist, Erin Anderson, here. Erin works with the public and Xerces staff to reduce pesticide use in residential landscapes, including promoting alternative pest control measures and pollinator-friendly gardening practices. Prior to joining Xerces in 2022, he researched pollinator conservation in urban landscapes, restored habitat for several endangered butterfly species, and worked in insect biocontrol. In 2021, he was a AAA-S Mass Media Fellow at the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, where he reported science and business stories. Erin has a PhD from Oregon State University, and outside of work, you can probably find him riding his bike, science writing, or fiddling with old cameras. So before we get started, and as a reminder, please stay muted. Leave your questions in the chat and we will get to them at the end of the presentation, time permitting. We are recording this presentation and we'll post it to our YouTube channel soon. There will also be an email coming to registrants with the link to the recording, other relevant links, and presenter slides. We encourage you to make a donation today so that PPAN can continue to host this free webinar series. And this donation will really support our advocacy, education, and habitat creation efforts. And a donation of any size really does make a difference. So thank you for your consideration. And another way to support this work is by getting that beautiful pollinator license plate. And again, we'll put these links in the chat to make it easy for people. And with that, I will stop sharing and pass it over to Erin.
Great. Well, as Anna Gray said, my name is Aaron. I'm on the pesticide reduction team at the Xerces Society for Invertebrate Conservation. I mostly work in residential landscapes in towns and cities, working to reduce pesticide use and encourage pollinator-friendly landscaping and gardening practices. And yeah, both my colleague Jacqueline and I are really excited to be here today to talk about residential mosquito sprays and the risks they pose to pollinators. And yeah, thank you to PPAN for having us. And it's really great to talk to a group who's so deeply involved in pollinator conservation. And before I dive into my talk, I do want to quickly thank our Xerces supporters because without them, we couldn't do the work that we do. And I do want to note that we are a donor-supported nonprofit, so if you're at all interested, I encourage you to check out our website. Our members are a really extraordinary group of people who are inquisitive, engaged, and really care about protecting invertebrates. And again, we really rely on our members to do the work that we do. We also have this great new pesticide-free sign you can get for donating. And if you haven't heard of the Xerces Society before, and if this is your first webinar with us, we've been around since 1971, working to protect wildlife through the conservation of invertebrates and their habitats. And our name's a reference to the Xerces blue butterfly, which is believed to be the first American butterfly to go extinct due to human development. And it used to live in the coastal sand dune region around the San Francisco Bay Area. And this slide has a museum specimen. And we do a variety of on-the-ground conservation work. We have programs focusing on pollinators and agricultural biodiversity. We work on endangered species, pesticides, of course. We also do a lot of community engagement work in residential communities. We really work in all sorts of areas, and this slide has some representative photos of those areas. I always like to point out we have people who are working on freshwater mussels. I do nothing with that, but I think it's really cool. But I think maybe the most helpful work we do is writing detailed science-based guides for protecting pollinators and other invertebrates. And you can visit our website for free, both national and regional resources on plants, pollinators, invertebrates. And this library is really decades of work and has some really great resources. So I encourage you to all go check it out at xerces.org. So I want to give you a quick outline of where we're going to go with this talk, so we're all on the same page. We're going to start with a quick primer on mosquito biology, and then talk about the risks of mosquito sprays for adult mosquitoes, and talk about the results of a Xerces study we did on residential mosquito sprays. And then we'll spend some time talking about ecologically responsible solutions at home and at the community level, both practical and policy level. And before we dive into the meat of the talk, I do want to spend a slide talking about why this matters. Given the audience I'm talking to right now, I'm sure most of you are already aware that many recent studies are documenting declines in insect populations in communities worldwide. And the data is a little patchy since many insects, in fact, most insects, aren't carefully monitored. But the data we do have almost all points to decreases in populations around the world. And we know enough to know that it's essential to take action to conserve pollinators and other insects. And there's several causes that scientists agree on, with the largest being habitat loss. But another leading cause are pesticides. And as we'll discuss, residential mosquito sprays can be a big source of pesticide exposure in our residential landscapes. So I want to spend a slide just talking about pesticide risks really quickly. So pesticide is an umbrella term. It covers insecticides, which kill insects, but also herbicides, which kill plants, fungicides, which target fungi and mildew, and there's more. And all of these can be concerning in different ways. But today with mosquito sprays, we're really focusing on insecticides. And modern insecticides are very potent, and newer ones that have been made to replace older chemicals are more friendly to bees and are actually more concerning in many ways. Uh, Most of you are likely aware that many insecticides are highly toxic to pollinators and other insects. Some insecticides are more targeted than others in the groups of insects they impact, but many tend to be very broad. They'll kill the target pests, but also everything else in your yard or garden. And I also want to note really quickly that one of the other downsides of pesticides is that they only treat the symptom, the pest outbreak, not the cause of the outbreak. So we like to say it's like taking Advil for a headache when really you need to get new glasses or stop staring at computer screens. And as we talk about pests, I think it's important to note that 98% of insects aren't what we would consider pests. And this might catch you by surprise because pest species get a lot of attention, but only an estimated 2% of insects cause economic damages or health damages to people. And the rest are vital as food for other species. They recycle nutrients, they provide pest control and pollination. But as Rachel Carson once said, yet most of the chemicals now used kill all insects, our friends and enemies alike. Okay, so I want to spend a few slides talking about mosquitoes, their biology, life cycle, and also where they kind of fit into the ecosystem. And I think this is really important because a message that we like to share is that in order to understand how to truly manage any pest, not just mosquitoes, it's important to know the life cycle so you can break that life cycle so the pest can't thrive. So mosquitoes lay their eggs in stagnant water, and they only need a small amount of water, about the amount in a bottle cap, to reproduce. And females typically lay about 100 eggs at a time, and adult females can lay multiple times in their lifespan. And once those eggs are in that suitable still water, the eggs will hatch in as soon as just a few days after being laid. And then they're then larvae, which are represented at the bottom of the circle on this slide. So the larvae are aquatic and they feed on microorganisms in the water, and they'll develop into pupa in about 5 days. And that can be quicker if the temperature is really warm. And then the pupa are the last stage before they become flying adults, and pupation takes only about 2 to 3 days, and then the adult mosquito flies off. So this means that the entire life cycle of a mosquito can take place in as few as 5 to 10 days. And with the number of eggs they can lay, up to 500 for a female, this means they can reproduce really quickly. And despite the common misconception that mosquitoes are nothing but a nuisance or a health risk, they can actually play ecological roles. So they are a food source for a wide range of different organisms, both when they're adults and larvae. And larval mosquitoes actually contribute to nutrient cycling in wetland areas. The larval stage, again, is aquatic, living in water. And some of these are obviously eaten by aquatic predators, but the surviving mosquitoes that fly to land are either eaten by predators or die and decompose on land and actually help contribute to the movement of nutrients from wetlands to upland areas. And they're really tiny, so this might not seem very substantial, but in Alaska, for example, there's an estimated 96 million pounds of mosquitoes that hatch each year, which is a really big amount of biomass. And mosquitoes can also be pollinators. Though they might not pollinate at the levels of bees or other types of flies, adult mosquitoes do visit flowers to sip nectar for energy. And unlike bees, they're not actively collecting pollen. This is why bees are such good pollinators. They're actively collecting and moving those pollen grains. But mosquitoes do get pollen grains stuck to them and can pollinate sometimes as generalists. But there are some flowers that have actually evolved to have mosquitoes pollinate them. One example that's shared a lot is the blunt-leafed orchid, which is found throughout the northern parts of the country from the northwest into the northeast. And researchers have found that certain mosquitoes are actually attracted to that orchid because of certain chemical compounds in its odor. And orchids that don't produce that odor don't attract mosquitoes. So while it's not a major part of pollination, they can play that role. And of course, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that mosquitoes can be vectors of disease that impact both humans and livestock. And this concern is, of course, really real, with a changing climate expanding the range of some mosquito species, along with international travel potentially spreading new mosquito-borne diseases, creating growing concern about new diseases establishing in the US. And then, of course, existing diseases can be really worrisome as well. You know, there's encephalitis, West Nile. There's concern over Zika. Even dengue fever has been found in Texas, Hawaii, Florida, and outlying territories. So throughout this talk, I want to in no way minimize the seriousness of these diseases, nor the risk that they can pose to people. But there are many times that insecticides are used to treat mosquitoes that is unnecessary, won't actually help solve any human health concerns, and will broadly impact that broader insect community. And this includes backyard mosquito spray services that we're focusing on. There's more ecologically sound strategies that are more effective and less harmful to pollinators and other beneficial insects. So on that note, let's talk a little bit about residential mosquito sprays. So I want to start with a quick background here about mosquito treatments in residential areas and the types of sprays that are frequently used. Many of you might be familiar with this, but I think it's kind of important to review. There's largely two types, and these are barrier sprays in home yards and sprays, or what's often termed fogging, performed by mosquito control districts or vector control districts. Pyrethroids are the most commonly used insecticides for residential mosquito sprays. And as a group, these are highly toxic insecticides that kill much more than just mosquitoes. They're what's called broad spectrum, meaning they kill all sorts of other insects and invertebrates as well. Pyrethroids are related to pyrethrins, which are a naturally occurring toxin that are found in chrysanthemum flowers. But pyrethroids are synthetic versions that are similar in structure, but often much more toxic and more persistent, which means they're more long-lived than pyrethrins. And I should add that some pyrethroids, like bifenthrin, meet the definition of PFAS, commonly known as forever chemicals, by the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. So the risk to insects can vary from these pyrethroid sprays. The biggest impact is likely to the insects that are out flying or out crawling on plants when these sprays happen and get contacted directly by that application spray or fog. But some species might crawl a lot on treated plants, which increases the amount of insecticide they're exposed to. If a treatment is designed to persist for a few weeks, for example, this risk is even greater, especially to pollinators like butterflies and moths, since the caterpillars the larval stage of these pollinators feed on leaf tissue. And even if sprays happen in the evening or the early morning, there's many insects that are active at these times of days who can be directly exposed. Both municipal and backyard sprays often have what are called synergists added to the mixture. So these are chemicals that actually increase the toxicity of the insecticides, which are already very potent. Piperonal butoxide is the synergist that's often used in these mosquito sprays, and it actually inhibits the insects from being able to detoxify the pyrethroids, which makes them more deadly. And how much of an impact this has depends, of course, on how much is added, but studies have found kind of an enhancement of toxicity of about 1 to 5 times from including PBO. So home barrier sprays, which we're largely focusing on today, are typically sprayed by private companies that advertise their services to homeowners. You may have had these services come by, knock on your door, leave flyers, put little signs in your neighbors' yards. They typically spray pyrethroid or a mix of different pyrethroids, and they'll, again, sometimes include those synergists as well. And applicators spray these sprays with a relatively larger droplet size, and they're designed to both kill mosquitoes that are in the air and where they're roosting in vegetation, but then to also coat the leaves of the vegetation in the yard and remain as a barrier that they claim is both repellent and toxic for up to 3 weeks, after which they recommend reapplication. And here's a photo of an applicator applying a barrier spray along a property line. This chicken wire fence is a little bit hard to see, so I added a red arrow to kind of make that fence line more visible. But you can see how the applicator is spraying that pesticide spray or that insecticide spray right along the property line. And then on the other hand, we have vector control districts, which are tasked with managing mosquitoes on a more community-wide level. And they mostly use ultra-low volume or what are called ULV sprays. And these sprayers aerosolize pesticides so they can disperse widely through an area using super small droplet sizes so the pesticides hang in the air. Again, they most often use pyrethroids, though in some places they still use organophosphates, another highly toxic group of insecticides. And there's often trucks used, like the one in this picture, but in some places, aerial sprays from airplanes happen. And depending on the location and district, these happen at the town level, some are at the county level. This can kind of vary by state and municipality. So we know there are risks from these sprays. We know the pesticides used are broadly toxic and are applied in an indiscriminate manner, but there hasn't been a lot of research about barrier spray toxicity to beneficial insects. But there was one study that found that monarch caterpillars that were fed treated leaves or leaves that were treated by a barrier spray had much lower survival rates than control caterpillars. And for these vector control district sprays, there have been documented die-off events, like a monarch die-off after a vector control district spray in South Dakota, and a honeybee die-off after one in South Carolina. But we wanted to learn a bit more about the risks of these backyard sprays, and in particular, the risk from neighboring sprays. People will often ask us, I'm creating pollinator habitat in my yard, but my neighbor sprays for mosquitoes. And they wonder if they shouldn't be creating habitat because of these neighboring mosquito sprays. And the worry is that these yards will be what's called an ecological trap, which essentially means they'll be luring pollinators into what appears to be really high quality habitat when it's actually going to be poor quality. And we didn't really have an answer to that question, so we wanted to get a sense of what are the risks of these backyard mosquito sprays to pollinators, particularly in neighboring yards. And here's a quick example and kind of a story that helped inspire this study. One of our Xerces members sent us this video. She had observed a mosquito spray service coming to her neighbor's yards every 2 weeks, and the spray was drifting up as the applicator was applying it. So when I hit play here, keep an eye on the middle of the video, where you can see a mosquito spray company employee, and then you can visibly see kind of a pesticide plume and some droplets in the air. So she was wondering how far these applications drift and what the risk to her yard was. And I should note that in this case, she did get her state ag department to test her plants. They did test positive for bifenthrin residue, the pesticide the mosquito spray company was spraying. And kind of the great success story here was she was able to have a conversation with her neighbor who ended up stopping spraying and using some more ecologically friendly mosquito control methods. And anecdotally, she said she saw much more insect life in her yard afterwards. So there was kind of a happy ending there. So going back to our study, here's the very quick summary of our experiment. So we tried to recruit volunteers who have a neighbor who hires a backyard spray service so that we could sample their adjacent yard. But while we were recruiting volunteers, we unexpectedly found 4 volunteers who actually hire one of those services. So we got to include those as a data point as well. And this was unexpected, but it gave us kind of another layer of data, which was really great. And we also found people who received vector control district sprays in their yards. And these volunteers were in 3 different states, in Georgia, Iowa, and Massachusetts. And we had volunteers hang silicone bands, which were really great for this type of study because they capture all sorts of chemicals. And they hung these bands prior to a known mosquito spray event in their yard and then collected them afterwards. So these were our main research questions. How much residue is deposited from these private mosquito sprays? How much residue drifts from neighbors' applications? How much residue results from these mosquito control district sprays? And then what risk do any detected residues pose to invertebrates, in particular pollinators? So here's a few photos of the bands in the field. They kind of blend in, which is kind of a good and a bad thing. We lost a couple bands to lawnmowers, so if we do this again, maybe we keep some flags on the wires or something to make them a little bit more visible. But yeah, after these spray events, the volunteers collected the bands, and then we shipped them to a lab that tested them for over 300 different chemical compounds. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the results of our study. So what did we find? So we detected 12 insecticides and one of those synergists, again, which increased the toxicity of insecticides. 6 of these compounds were pyrethroids, presumably used in mosquito control sprays. We also found 3 insect growth regulators, which some private spray companies include to also try to kill immature mosquitoes, but of course they also do impact all sorts of other insects as well. The pyrethroid bifenthrin was in over 75% of our test samples. It was really ubiquitous across these sites, across all 3 states, which was really interesting. And again, this is classified as a PFAS, and it was being found all over the landscape. And then finally, 75% of the bands that were placed in yards neighboring a property being actively sprayed by a backyard spray company had pesticide contamination on them, which really shows how common off-site movement from these applications is. Okay, so then the next question is how much did we find? So for the number of insecticides, we found an average of 4.1 compounds per actively sprayed yard, 1.2 compounds per neighbor drift yard, and 1.9 compounds per mosquito control district sprayed yard. And overall, we found 100 or about 1,500 nanograms per gram in sprayed yards, 28.6 in neighbor drift yards, and 7.3 nanograms per gram in mosquito control district sprayed yards. So these raw numbers are really hard to interpret and don't mean much without context, but the takeaway is that yards directly sprayed had a lot of insecticides. Yards with neighbor drift had several orders of magnitude less on average, and then these vector control district sprayed yards had the lowest average amount. But we did want to try to figure out what these numbers mean in a more real world sense. And this is really tricky, and these values should be very much thought of as ballpark estimates. But we did some math to try to go from how much pesticide residue was sprayed on these bands to how much would have been sprayed on a bee that was present when these sprays were occurring. We used the non-native European honeybee as our model because unfortunately pesticide toxicity isn't known for most of our native bee species. And in fact, as an aside, that's a really big data gap and a challenge to do this type of work. How most pesticides impact most of our native pollinator species isn't known, so we have to rely on proxy species like the honeybee, even though our native species are often more sensitive. But what we found was that yards directly sprayed by these barrier spray services had on average 6.6 times the amount of pyrethroids that would be toxic to honeybees, what's known as the contact LD50, the lethal dose 50. And the yards with the highest values were over 34 and 24 times that lethal dose, which was really astounding. Yards with neighbor drift had much lower, on average zero 0.12, so about 12% of that lethal dose. But the highest level in a neighbor drift yard was 2 times the lethal dose, so the potential for acute risk still is there from these neighboring sprays. And then the mosquito control district sprays were the lowest with an average of 0.03 times the honeybee lethal dose, with the highest being about 13%. So I think one of the biggest takeaways from our small study here is that spraying a yard for mosquitoes carries a really high potential risk to other invertebrates, including pollinators. The fact that we found 24 and 34 times a honeybee lethal dose in two different yards was really pretty astounding. And then furthermore, I want to note that contamination below those lethal levels can still be very harmful. And there's almost certainly impacts at these lower levels of contamination that are also concerning. So this could be something like decreased reproduction, decreased foraging success, decreased or I should say delayed development. These are all things that might not kill an individual pollinator, but over time can add up to impact populations and impact a population's ability to reproduce. There's also likely chronic impacts on long-lived individuals and populations over time. If these sprays are happening bi-weekly to every 3 weeks, from potentially March into November, depending on your location, this chronic exposure, this time over time exposure, even at low levels, can carry extra risk. I do want to stress that our samples are just one snapshot in time. And, in the grand scheme of things, we're only, conducted on a handful of different yards in a handful of different places. So you might ask, what can you do to protect your backyard habitat from mosquito sprays or other types of backyard sprays? And first, again, we'd recommend not hiring these spray services to come spray your yard. We know the amount of insecticides resulting from these sprays is really high and at levels that will likely kill all sorts of beneficial insects in your yard. But if your neighbors spray, there are several strategies that you can try. First, if you feel comfortable and you have the type of relationship, you can try having a conversation with them. We, again, have had some Xerces members who really have had success talking to their neighbor who sprays. But I acknowledge that not everybody will be in a position to do that or have the type of relationship that they feel comfortable with. We did just come out with a new publication on how to talk to your neighbor about pesticide use, which I think is helpful, and I'm happy to drop it into the chat. But if you don't want to talk to your neighbor, you could always, I know this isn't the most satisfying answer, but you could always place your habitat on the other side of the yard from where drift is coming from. Drift will decrease over distance. So that's one strategy. You could also plant what's called a drift barrier. Made up of non-flowering shrubs that will actually help intercept the drift that's coming into your yard. Counterintuitively, you don't want to use something like a fence because drift can hit that hard surface and then be pushed up and over into the fence into your yard. So you want something that air can flow through, but that's dense enough that the pesticide droplets are filtered out. And of course, you don't want it to be something that's used as a resource by pollinators and other beneficial insects. So something like a non-flowering evergreen shrub like arborvitae in this picture work really well for that. This is an illustration of a drift barrier in an agricultural context, but it still kind of illustrates that concept of how it will intercept pesticide drift. Okay, so now that we've talked about the downsides of chemical mosquito control, I do want to spend a few slides talking about what you can do to help manage mosquitoes at home. And the number one thing you can do is simply eliminate standing water. You will also hear this called source reduction. As we talked about earlier, adult mosquitoes lay their eggs in still water where they hatch and develop. And each female can lay hundreds of eggs, and mosquitoes only need about 1 inch of water to reproduce. And water that stands around for just over a week can lead to a population explosion. So it's really important to start doing this early because this will help keep mosquito populations from building. And you should look for water in buckets, in trash cans, look for hidden flower pots or old tires that might have filled with rain. I also suggest seeing if your gutters are clogged, because this can frequently be kind of a surprise, unseen source of stagnant water. If you have bird baths or pet bowls, you can prevent mosquito larvae from completing their life cycle by dumping them out every 5 days or a week and refilling them. You can even look for places like potholes in a driveway or depressions in a lawn that you can fill in, because often these can harbor just those little amounts of standing water that are enough to have mosquitoes reproduce in. If you do have a backyard pond, you can manage it to better support natural enemies that will feed on mosquitoes. You can include diverse plantings that will provide habitat for predators of larval mosquitoes like dragonflies and damselflies. These all have the same basic needs. They need clean water, food, and habitat that serves as a refuge to mate and reproduce in. This is getting a little bit beyond the scope of this talk, but we do have resources for managing backyard ponds for dragonflies and damselflies available in that online Xerces library. It has really detailed instructions about pond construction, location, plant choice, more. So feel free to look that up if it's of interest to you. And if you have a permanent human constructed body of water, the simple inclusion of a water feature or even just a small pump to keep the water moving a little bit is all that's needed to make your pond inhospitable to mosquito larvae. And if you do use an open water pump, we recommend adding some protective screening since those pumps can pull in dragonfly and damselfly nymphs and kill them. And you obviously want to protect those natural enemies. So beyond getting rid of standing water and using a pump in any type of water feature, there's other preventative measures you can take to avoid being bitten. Protecting yourself from bites by wearing long sleeves when mosquitoes are active and using a repellent are always great ideas. You should also make sure that your window screens are intact so that mosquitoes can't come indoors. And if you do want to use a porch or a patio on a mosquito-y evening, you can consider putting out a fan when you're sitting on your patio because mosquitoes can't fly even in really light winds. So that's a good way to enjoy your space while not being bitten by mosquitoes. And these might sound really simple or very obvious, but they do work. Here's an example of a quick success story, kind of in mosquito vector disease management that highlights the importance of prevention at home. And it was located close to you all. During a 2003 West Nile virus outbreak, researchers surveyed residents in both Fort Collins and in Loveland, and they found that Fort Collins residents were much more likely to implement personal protective measures like wearing long sleeves and applying repellent and avoiding outdoor activities when mosquitoes are the most active. And despite that Fort Collins actually had a greater abundance of mosquitoes and more West Nile positive mosquitoes compared to Loveland, Fort Collins had about half as many incidences of severe disease, likely because the community was using more of these preventative measures. So this is a really interesting case study of how impactful prevention can be. And at the community level, there are also grassroots things you can do. The more people who are working together, the more effective mosquito management is. If you're doing all of this great work reducing standing water on your property, but your neighbor isn't, mosquitoes will obviously just fly across your property. So the more people in a neighborhood and a community doing this work together, the better. I think a really great example of a broader community-wide campaign is in Decatur, Georgia. They're part of Xerces Bee City USA program, in which affiliate communities make several different commitments to protect pollinators. And one of these is pesticide reduction. And Decatur has done a lot of really great outreach on mosquito spraying. They don't have a vector control district that sprays, so in turn, many residents instead hire these private spray companies. And to address this, they have an information section about residential mosquito sprays on their Bee City website. They've developed literature to hand out, and they've also created these really large mosquito spraying kills bees branded signs to put in yards. They also make use of social media. They table at events like farmers markets and nurseries. They do presentations to neighborhood associations and community groups. They even work with the city's Environmental Sustainability Board to enact formal policies. So I think this is a really great example of community members who have come together to do outreach, education, and policy targeted at reducing pesticide use in their community. And my last slide here before I turn it over to Jacqueline is just, again, talking about scaling up to the community level. As you know, local vector control districts or municipalities are in charge of managing mosquito populations on public lands and coordinating community-wide responses. And many of them do really fantastic work. Boulder is an example that we often share as just a really great municipality with this really wonderful holistic program. In other cases, management plans might be lacking. And again, this is a little bit outside what we're focusing on today, but I wanted to note as a quick general summary, a good mosquito control district program involves investing in public education and communication to make sure everyone knows what they can do to stay safe, healthy, and reduce mosquito populations at home through some of the methods we talked about today. But it should also involve active monitoring of mosquitoes and thresholds for tolerance, in particular for disease incidents and populations of those mosquito species that are the ones responsible for vectoring diseases. High populations of other mosquito species might be a significant nuisance, warranting non-chemical reduction efforts, but they're not what should trigger chemical treatments. And when diseases are found at concerning levels and a municipality decides to treat, we always encourage ecologically responsible interventions and trying to use least toxic efforts. And we have a publication on how to help your community create an effective mosquito management plan, which might be of interest for some people in the audience. And again, I want to be very clear that we don't want to downplay the risk from disease, but in general, spraying for adult mosquitoes isn't going to be the best long-term way to control mosquitoes. And now I'll turn this over to Jacqueline to talk a bit about state policy solutions.
Thanks so much, Erin, for setting the stage and presenting all of that great information. So I think as we've been discussing over the last half hour or so, the Xerces Society and PPAN, we're always looking for ways to help transform all of this science into real action that people can take for pollinator conservation and also protecting people too from disease. And so that includes all of the great things that Erin just talked about, the at-home prevention, talking to your neighbors, improving community level practices, all of those things. But those are all just individual pieces of the puzzle, right? And they're all very important to protecting people from mosquito-borne disease. But what we found by working on this issue is that even when you are doing everything right in your own backyard, your neighbor still might choose to hire one of these services, right? Which is not the most effective way to protect us from disease. Or even when your local control district is doing a perfect mosquito management plan, the next county over might be spraying pesticides all summer long that drifts into your community, right? And so that is why sometimes policy at the state level is really important, especially when we are looking at an issue like mosquito management, which is really most effective when everyone is working together at that larger scale. And so, to that effect, the Xerces Society recently developed this menu, I'll call it, of policy options that we recently published online with our partners that covers options that state legislatures can take to limit harm from private pest control. You can go to the next slide. Thank you. So I will go over some of these policy option menus here over the next few minutes. The first item on our menu of policy options is to make sure that private pest control services market their services honestly and accurately. And I think the need for this is really best illustrated with a story. So I was talking with one of our Xerces members whose neighbor hired a service to spray for mosquitoes every few weeks. And she was a bit concerned about what was in those sprays and what was potentially getting into her yard. So this is a quote from her. She said, I reached out to the company. The lady on the phone said, I can assure you we only use essential oils and it is so safe. They even gave her that flyer that you're seeing a picture of it on your screen there. Well, she still had, a funny feeling. It didn't pass the smell test. So she called her state Department of Agriculture. They came out and tested the vegetation on her property. Lo and behold, it tested positive for bifenthrin, which is one of those synthetic pyrethroids. So we believe that if you or your neighbor are hiring someone to spray something on your property, you have a right to know what is being sprayed and to not be lied to about it. And that's really the essence of this policy option. So fortunately, there are ways to solve this issue, and states are already taking action on this. So one option is to restrict the use of false claims in advertising. So making sure that someone can't come up to your door or give you a flyer in the mail that says this is all natural if it isn't all natural, right? Another option is to make sure that those companies provide you with the actual pesticide label. So this picture that you're seeing is an actual pesticide label for something that contains bifenthrin, whereas the flyer that that individual received on the last slide, that was just a promo flyer, right? That wasn't the real pesticide label. Some states actually require that the sales staff that are coming to your door selling you these services, they require that those folks are actually licensed pesticide applicators. And so that's another way to ensure that the people making the sales are actually trained on the pesticides that they are selling. And you can go ahead to the next slide. Oh, one more after that. Awesome, thanks. So another policy option here is to strengthen the notification requirements when private pest control services are being utilized. And so I'll be clear, this doesn't prevent those pesticide applications from occurring, but it just helps give people some warning. So one person told me I now get constant headaches as I'm a gardener and I'm always outside. The companies are not even required to put up signs after they fog. So this is the case in many places where residents are really unknowingly exposing themselves or their loved ones to toxic chemicals simply because they don't know when and where these sprays have occurred. You can go ahead to the next slide. Thank you. And so there's really good legislative precedent here. This is being done in other places, which is great. So New York and Connecticut both have a system of neighbor notification where if one property is using a private pest control service, that company, the onus is on the company, is actually obligated to notify the neighbors of that treatment so that everyone is prepared. New York and Illinois also require signage in areas where pesticides have been applied. So people and pets don't walk into an area that has been sprayed without knowing that that spray has occurred. And one way to go even further here is to require specific re-entry limitations. And so that would have a time period where no one is allowed to re-enter the area after a spray has occurred for a certain amount of time to protect those people and their pets and anyone else from being in that space and being exposed to those residues. Next slide, please. So another option here is to put restrictions more directly on private pest control services. The bottom line, is that these sprays can be really harmful, harmful to people, harmful to wildlife, and evidence shows that they drift. So folks are really just trying to feed their families with backyard gardens or just trying to enjoy being on their back porch with loved ones. And that's not possible in a lot of cases when they're concerned about drift. So one person told me, no wonder the yield in my once organic vegetable garden is declining as I watch the clouds of insecticide billow over the boundary between my neighbor's property and into mine. And, sometimes I hear the argument of, there are just a few bad apples. There's a few bad applicators out there. Don't punish the whole industry for a few bad apples. But I want to be really clear here. The study that, Aaron just presented about, this is telling us that this isn't just a few bad apples. This is the nature of the way these pesticides are applied. We are seeing chemical trespass the majority of the time, 75% of the time. And so that's why a strong route here is to more directly restrict these kinds of activities. You can go to the next slide. So again, the good news, there's already precedent for this kind of legislation. So New York and Connecticut, they ban these pesticide misting systems. And so these private misting systems, sometimes people will attach them to the fencing on their property, and it will spray pesticide at a regular interval on that property. Illinois also restricts those barrier sprays that Aaron was talking about from mid-October through mid-April. And if we think about it, this is not a time period where mosquitoes are active anyway. And so those sprays really aren't doing much other than contaminating the yard and not killing any mosquitoes. So a few ways to go further here are to prohibit these subscription services where people sign up for a subscription that comes back, every 3 weeks and kind of locks people into that contract. Another option is to ban the use of PFAS pesticides in private pest control. And as Aaron mentioned, that most prevalent pesticide that we detected in that study bifenthrin was a PFAS, and that was on 75 or 76% of yards. And you can go to the next slide. So in the absence of state action, another option here is to give that authority to regulate the issue back to local governments. And so I love this quote on the approach from a senator in Pennsylvania who said, local disputes over pesticide use and drift in dense residential neighborhoods should not be taking up the time and resources of a state agency. Neighbors should be able to resolve these incidents locally, and municipal governments are better suited than the Department of Agriculture to do just that. Next slide. And this is being done in states across the country, including our close neighbors in Utah and Nevada. So one option is to ensure that the state government does not preempt or restrict local governments from putting rules in place that reflect the values and needs of their community. Another option is to provide a pathway for local municipalities to amend pesticide regulations. So Louisiana has something like this, where they provide a legal pathway for a municipality to say, hey, this rule really isn't working for us. We need something different. And then another option is to allow local regulation in special cases, such as to protect drinking water or prevent drift in cases where that is more severe. Next slide. And the last policy option that I'm going to talk about today is expanding state programs for mosquito management and vector management. And so we know, and we've mentioned that when it comes to managing mosquitoes and the diseases that they carry, this is really most effectively done at the community level and at the state level. And there is no evidence that having your yard sprayed by a private company reduces your risk of disease. I know that people most of the time are doing this because they think it's what's best for them. They think it's what's best to protect them and their families from disease. But there's no evidence that having your yard sprayed is effective at that. So another avenue here is to make government and vector control activities more effective through state level policy. And the idea is that if your vector control district is doing a better job at preventing born disease, people will be protected and they will be less tempted to hire a private service to spray their yard. And so Massachusetts Senator Comerford put this really well. Cities and towns are asking for us to give them the tools to protect the environment, their residents, and public health. And next slide. So there are a few different facets of an effective state program. I'll touch on just a few that can be enhanced through policy. So first, policy can be used to increase funding for state programs that monitor mosquitoes and disease and engage in source reduction or removing standing water that can harbor mosquitoes. Another angle is to expand public education efforts. So this can look like educating residents on how they can reduce sources of standing water on their own property, as well as how they can protect themselves against mosquitoes by wearing proper clothing, long sleeves and pants, and using personal repellents. Another option that's been explored in states like Massachusetts is to prohibit pesticide use and aerial spraying by state and regional mosquito control programs unless there's actually a risk of disease. So this not only protects people and ecosystems from sprays that are not necessary, it also reduces the chances that mosquitoes will become resistant to these insecticides, which makes those insecticides, if we make sure that mosquitoes don't become resistant, those insecticides are actually going to be effective when we really need them in the case of emergencies. Next slide. So these policy options and more are available in the new menu that the Xerces Society developed in collaboration with our partners at NCEL, or the National Caucus of Environmental Legislators. So that QR code on the screen will take you to that menu. And a little bit about NCEL, they are a nonpartisan organization. They work to coordinate over 1,200 state legislators across the country to put forth legislation for healthy, safe, and clean environments. And of course, we know that that protects people too. So I'm thrilled to say that this menu has already helped legislators introduce legislation, including a bill that was introduced in Maryland earlier this year. And we're really excited to see where this spreads next and are rooting to see some action in Colorado. Next slide. So finally, what can you do with this information, even if you yourself are not a legislator, right? Well, legislators love to hear from their constituents. That is what they are here for. So reach out to them. If this is an issue that matters to you, I encourage you, the more people that they hear this from, the more likely we are to see some movement. You can also share the policy menu with your local and state leaders and get the word out by writing letters to the editor and op-eds in your local newspaper to really get the word out in your community. And that is the last one from me, and I will pass it back to Aaron.
Thanks, Jacqueline. That was so informative, as always. So we're pretty much at the end of our talk here, but I just wanted to end by just mentioning that a great reason to be focused on protecting our yards and parks from pesticides is that our urban areas, our residential areas, our towns and cities really do hold such a high potential for pollinator conservation. Our residential areas can function as really high quality habitat and refuges for pollinators and other insects and other animals, even at the single site level, like a yard or a park. But together, numerous sites, getting your neighbors involved, your friends, your local community, we can really scale up and provide connected functional habitat across our urban and suburban landscapes. But these areas need to be managed properly to kind of achieve that goal, and that includes protecting these areas from pesticides. So I want to quickly note that we have a variety of resources related to what we were just talking about today that might be helpful. Here's a few that are particularly relevant. We have other resources for community pesticide reduction. So again, I encourage you to go to our site, download these. We also are about to come out with a new mosquito brochure that talks about the risks of backyard mosquito sprays on one side, and then the inside has some of those kind of common sense and non-chemical mosquito reduction methods that we talked about. And it's illustrated really wonderfully by our new employee, Madison, who lives in Colorado, actually. And she did an amazing job illustrating this. So we'll have that hopefully up on the Xerces site within the next couple of weeks. So keep an eye out for that as well. I think it'll be a useful publication for just handing out to friends and neighbors.